New York in the 1800s was overcrowded, crime-infested, and, for the poor and homeless, a living hell. If anyone was to expose the seedy goings-on in this underworld to the wider public, a fearless investigative journalist was required. There was just such a man, and his name was Arthur Pember, an Englishman who ventured into Manhattan's criminal underworld to expose crime and corruption. Working undercover for the New York Tribune in the late 1860s and early 1870s, he exposed crime and prostitution, going to great lengths to uncover corruption, even to the extent of assuming disguises. Today, he continues his investigation dressed as a homeless beggar, and, in this account, you will discover his experiences of begging on New York's dangerous streets. Discover how he managed to disguise his well-to-do appearance and educated voice to become unnoticed on the sidewalks. And find out that whilst some had sympathy for his story of a hungry man down on his luck, others, including the police, treated him with contempt. The life of a beggar was brutal, facing constant hardship, freezing cold weather, and certainly not a life our investigator ever wanted to experience again. Before we move on, if you're interested in history like this, and you want to find out more about what life was really like for people in the past, please consider subscribing for more content. If you'd like to support what we make for you, check out the description for links to ways you can help us to continue bringing the past alive. Lost anything, boss? I started, as though a dozen of Professor Tyndall's electric batteries had been discharged through me simultaneously, and confronted a specimen of the purest water of the Celtic race. He was gracefully indulging in the undeniable luxury of a short clay pipe as he leaned his elbow on the gateway of the family pigsty, and was regarding my movements with an excess of curiosity which might possibly, I thought, change by a self-converting process into hostility. No, I had lost nothing, and yet I felt very much like a detected sneak thief as I nervously replied in the negative to the enquiry of the squatter lord of the rocky domain on whose premises I was trespassing. "I thought you was looking for something," rejoined the Irish self-appointed lord of the manor. "Looking for something? I had been prowling in search of something for nearly 2 hours among the shanties, the children, the goats, the cows and the dirty ducks and geese, which seemed to love to congregate around the boundaries of the Central Park. I fully believe that I had explored Ragtown from end to end. I had been stared at by idle men, for it was Sunday, and clean shirt sleeves were the order of the day. I had been thoroughly appraised by slatternly women. I had been followed by goats and unwashed, unkempt, stockingless children, and growled at by curs. But this naturalized citizen was the only being who had so far verbally expressed any curiosity to learn what brought me there. He certainly, at first, mistook me for a poultry stealer or a detective police officer, for, in the words of the old rhyme, he eyed me up, he eyed me down, as though I owned one half the town. Endeavouring to assume an air of supreme indifference, I pursued my search, and shortly afterward, much to my joy, lighted on the very thing I was seeking for. An old, worn-out and discarded boot. I clutched it with all the eagerness of a diamond digger, and, stuffing it into the pocket of my overcoat, I retraced my steps, muttering to myself, "It don't match very well, but perhaps so much the better." My Irish friend had evidently been all along watching my every movement, either from a feeling of suspicion or of insatiable curiosity, for, as I again passed his tumble-down wooden castle, he turned his head slowly, and, after a lavish expectoration, remarked to his next-door neighbour, "That man's as mad as the devil." Had he really been aware of my intentions, it is probable that he would have rendered his adjectives in the superlative degree, and much more forcibly. The fact is, like Don Quixote, the spirit of adventure was strong upon me, but unlike Don Quixote, I had no faithful Sancho Panza to perform my bidding in the way of making preparations, nor have I any Cervantes to chronicle my deeds. Unlike Philip Slingsby of the manly chest, I had not invoked anyone. Come be the Homer of the battle which I go to wage today. for the simple reason that I had determined to sing of my adventures myself at my leisure. But they were far from heroic. I was only going begging, and I wanted another worn-out boot to complete my outfit in true professional style. I had one that I had purloined from an ash barrel on 3rd Avenue. I had also a hat that I had picked up from a gutter in my neighbourhood, and I had purchased an old pair of pantaloons and a frock coat, which had once been black, but had faded into a green-brown shade of colour, from having swung for many months in the eddying gusts which played round an old clothes store in Avenue B, after they had been discarded by their original owner. In this regal apparel, I proposed to enter into competition with the aristocracy of beggardom for the charitable sympathies of the well-dressed and gold-scattering promenaders on Broadway. Belisarius, with his da obolum, was to be a fool to me, a phrase widely understood at the time, comparable to a great man reduced to asking for sympathy and support. Louis Philippe, begging for centimes at the corner of the Rue de la Paix, as his enemies were so fond. To give alms would be innocent compared with the imposture on the purse strings of the public which I proposed to perpetrate. Dim visions of founding an asylum for aged beggars out of the profits of my day's work floated airily through my brain, and, lost in the pleasurable contemplation of my adventure, regarding with the eye of an artist my worn-out boots and tattered apparel as they lay, ready to be donned, upon a chair before me, I believe that, for the moment, begging, as a means of gaining a livelihood, almost rose to the dignity of a profession in my eyes. Putting my begging costume into a satchel, on the following day I sought the rooms of a theatrical friend who had promised to aid me as a valet de chambre for the occasion, and, judging from my awkwardness when I began to array myself, I don't know what I should have done without him. He was also to use his green room knowledge in toning down my rather exuberant appearance of health. This he did to perfection. My eyes soon looked as though they were going on an exploring expedition into the interior of my head, and, generally, I looked woefully haggard, especially as I had not shaved for 5 days. Altogether, I presented an appearance that would have caused the heart of an undertaker to bound with joy at the prospect of coming business. But here came our first dilemma: how to reconcile those haggard features with a figure somewhat inclined to portliness. "There is no help for it but to strap you in, old fellow. You would never do without," observed my friend of the footlights. So I was strapped in, and for 7 long mortal hours I endured all the agonies of tight lacing. Yes, I can truthfully vouch for the discomforts and evils of this feminine foible. It took my ribs several hours to expand back again into their normal curves. Then came another trouble. We arrived at the conclusion that my coat looked too neat and tidy, although old, for a beggar. We proceeded at once to remedy this fault. We slit one sleeve for about 8 inches over the elbow and sewed a piece of old blue cloth as a patch over the shoulder. We then spread the coat out on the floor and sprinkled it all over with water, previous to beating the street doormat over it. We rubbed the dust well into the web of the cloth, dried the coat before the fire, and after beating off the worst of the dust, we had as shabby a coat as any professional beggar need desire. What a thing it is to know the tricks of your trade! The pantaloons were also improved by being put through pretty much the same process, and then we cut a piece about 2 inches square from the toe of one of the boots, putting a piece of dirty rag into the opening. I quickly arrayed myself, stuck some diacolon plaster on my forehead, wound some bandages of rags round my head and left hand, put on my hat, and, taking an old stick on which to lean tremblingly when opportunity offered, I stepped into the street from the kitchen entrance. I believe that I was as well got up a beggar as ever imposed on the charity of the generous public. My first impression on gaining the street was that everyone was staring at me, whereas, in all probability, I was totally unnoticed. At one moment I was half inclined to turn back and give up the adventure, when, fortunately, I caught sight of an acquaintance coming down the street. Here, thought I, is an opportunity to test my disguise without any chance of annoyance should the fraud be discovered. As he passed me, I begged of him in a feigned voice. He looked me full in the face, muttered something about being sorry that he had no pennies in his pocket, and went on in blissful ignorance as to my identity. The encounter at once inspired me with confidence, and I started up University Place, on my way to Union Square. Business soon came to me, as it does to all others who seek it with a will. At the corner of Union Square and 14th Street, a nice, kind-hearted-looking old lady in deep mourning gave me 2 cents. This was my first haul. My prospects were decidedly brightening, and the dread of going through the tight-lacing business and facing the fresh, nipping air to no purpose passed away. For, let me tell you, my scanty clothing anything but tended to keep up a desirable circulation of the blood. Moreover, my throat was all bare in front. My costume, too, was generally very uncomfortable. It anything but fitted me, and I felt as awkward as Sam Weller felt, or ought to have felt, when he first donned Mr. Pickwick's livery. I turned down 14th Street and wended my painful way to 5th Avenue with trembling steps. Near 18th Street, 2 young ladies caught me up. I turned and at once saw that I had an opportunity. The one nearest to me had an earnest, Madonna-looking face of considerable beauty. Her eye was tender and sympathetic, and I begged her to listen to me a moment. I told her a long story of how I had been crippled by an accident, and how I had just been discharged from Bellevue Hospital, after a sojourn of 6 weeks in that house of woe and suffering, that I was still very weak and unable to work, and that I had no money to buy anything to eat. She eyed me with a kindly gaze for a moment, took her purse out of her pocket, and handed me 10 cents. She did more. She gave me a very useful warning, for, as they passed on, she remarked to her companion, in sufficiently loud tones for me to hear, "I think that must be a deserving case. Didn't you notice how well the poor man talked?" Ah, too well, thought I to myself. That may pass muster with unsophisticated young ladies of sympathetic tendencies, but it won't do for the world in general. I must correct that. A gentleman standing under the portico of the 5th Avenue Hotel gave me a 5-cent piece, much to the disgust of a middle-aged gentleman who was talking to him, and who declared his conviction that all beggars are frauds. I gave him a look of pained, indignant remonstrance, and resumed my mendicant journeyings. Between 23rd Street and 34th Street, I met with very little success, and fancied that I was eyed with particular suspicion by the officer on the beat. But at the corner of 34th Street, I begged of 2 elderly ladies, who were apparently waiting for a car. One of them gave me 3, and the other 2 cents. I then passed down 34th Street to Broadway, and turned once more in the direction of the 5th Avenue Hotel, but I only picked up 2 or 3 single cents on the way. But I was approaching a better cruising ground for beggars. Between 23rd Street and 17th Street, only 6 blocks, I got 19 cents, a very elegantly dressed young lady contributing 5, and a sporting-looking gentleman who was lounging in the doorway of Jerry Thomas's saloon, 3 of them. I crossed over to Union Square and sat down on the edge of the basin of the fountain. From my pocket I drew a very stale crust of bread and commenced to nibble it, at the same time taking off my ragged hat and placing it on my knee. I tried my utmost to look like the hungry beggar who said, "Kind sir, I've had nothing to eat since yesterday, and tomorrow it'll be the 3rd day." This was a great card. A lady who was accompanied by 2 little girls quietly and unostentatiously dropped a 10-cent stamp into my hat, without saying a word. However, I saw a park officer approaching me, and, fearing that he might have seen the lady's action and might, in consequence, be hard-hearted enough to interfere with me, I determined to take time by the forelock and not stand upon the order of my going. So I pocketed my crust, put on my hat, and struck for the Bowery. I did the Bowery thoroughly, from Cooper Institute to Canal Street, shivering all the while with cold, not artificially, but naturally. I spent about an hour there, realizing altogether about 23 cents. I then took Canal Street, but all my efforts were unrewarded. In despair, I went into the reading room of the Brandreth House at the corner of Canal Street and Broadway, and begged successfully of the only two gentlemen who occupied it. One of them at first refused to give me anything. He was a hard, starch-visaged man, but when he saw his neighbour hand me a 5-cent piece, either his heart relented or he became ashamed of himself, for he followed the example as I passed him to leave the room. From the Brandreth House, I worked down Canal Street and along Carmine Street to 6th Avenue. 6th Avenue is not by any means a to-be-despised begging walk. I passed up the west side as far as 34th Street, and back again on the east side. At the corner of 13th Street, an old lady seemed wonderfully touched by my piteous tale, and raised the thermometer of my expectations up to fever heat. But she only gave me 1 cent. I retraced my steps once more through Carmine and Canal Streets to Broadway, my little store of pennies having received a very satisfactory increase. I was congratulating myself on the success of my enterprise when I experienced a scare which nearly brought my heart into my mouth. It almost made me long for a Californian earthquake, that the pavement would open and swallow me up. I had been standing at the corner of Canal Street for 2 or 3 minutes when I was almost startled out of my propriety on hearing a gruff voice say behind me, "Come, get along." There was no need to tell me that it was a gentleman in blue. I knew that instinctively, but the officer walked for a few paces by my side as I hobbled away, and he told a lie almost every step he took. He said he knew me well. Lie number 1. That I was an old hand at the business. Lie number 2. That I'd been at it ever since I last came from the island. Lie number 3. And that I was a first-class fraud. This last charge was about true. He parted with me after threatening to take me in and have me sent up if he caught me begging again. Some of the passers-by eyed me indignantly. Others sneered and jeered. But one old lady expressed her opinion that the police are very hard on beggars. She, however, did not offer me anything to assuage my wounded sensibility. Near the St. Nicholas Hotel I saw a lady vainly endeavouring to close the door of her carriage. I stepped forward and closed it for her, for which act of politeness she condescendingly handed me a penny. At the corner of Prince Street I encountered the editor of one of the oldest newspapers in New York, a gentleman with whom I am well acquainted. I begged of him, gave 2 or 3 very sepulchral coughs, and implored him to listen for a moment to my story. He stepped aside with me, and I poured into his sympathetic ear my Bellevue hospital tale. He listened very gravely and expressed his surprise that Mr. Brennan, the warden, who, he very properly said, bore a high reputation for kindness toward all the inmates of the hospital, should allow one of them to be discharged in the condition in which I then was. It was far too cold a day, he said, for a sick man to be wandering about the streets. He put a 25-cent stamp into my hand, gave me his office address, and said that if I would call there at 11 o'clock the next morning, he would give me a letter to Mr. Brennan, asking him to take me in again for a while. I called at the editorial sanctum of my friend at the appointed hour next day, when the following conversation ensued, after an exchange of the customary salutations. "I have called to pay you the 25 cents I borrowed of you yesterday." "Of me? Why, I did not see you yesterday." "Oh, yes, you did. I met you on Broadway." "No, sir, I say you did not. Why, your wits must have been wool-gathering. Why, this is the identical 25-cent stamp which you handed to me." "Well, where does the joke come in?" "No joke at all. There is your money, with thanks." "Wait a minute. Will," calling out to his son in the next room. "Yes, sir." Did you ever see me under the influence of liquor? No, Father, never. Then, Arthur, you must have been drunk yourself. There, take back your money, said my friend, again turning to me. At least, I put in, you'll give me the letter to Warden Brennan which you promised me. I never saw a man's face assume so thoroughly perplexed a look in my life. He stared at me in blank astonishment for several seconds, till at last the thing began to dawn upon him, and he burst out into a hearty laugh. He tried hard to bribe me to say nothing about it by offering to stand a bottle of champagne on those conditions, but St. Anthony came to my assistance, and I was proof against his alluring temptations. But I must return to my begging walk on Broadway, where the cold was rapidly becoming something more than I could stand. As I saw my face reflected in a shop window, I saw, also, that my nose was as red as a piece of raw beef, and that my cheeks had assumed a sort of washed-out plum colour. I felt that it was absolutely necessary to do something toward restoring my circulation, and I determined that, at the first opportunity I could get, I would have a good strong hot whiskey punch. Of course, this was not to be thought of on Broadway, but I thought I might venture it in the Bowery. I therefore crossed Broadway and went down Houston Street to carry out my intention. But no sooner had I reached the Bowery than I caught sight of a very charitable-looking gentleman, who had all the air of being a minister. I at once tackled him, and succeeded so well in working on his feelings as to draw from him 5 cents. I thanked him, and passed on. A few doors down I reached a liquor saloon, but here I encountered an unforeseen difficulty. No sooner had I stepped inside the door than the bartender, waving his hand at me, called out, "Come, get out of this. There's nothing here." "But I want a drink," I remonstrated. "Yes, so does a good many others. Come, get out," retorted the bartender. I saw at once the difficulty with him. He thought I was a deadbeat and wanted a drink for nothing, so I stepped up to the bar and told him that I was willing to pay for a drink. "Let's see your stamps, then," he rejoined, evidently still suspicious. I immediately produced 10 cents, and he proceeded to compound for me a glassful of the most villainous stuff that ever passed down my throat. However, it had the effect of making the blood tingle in my half-frozen toes and fingers. But, oh horror of horrors, as I closed the door of the saloon behind me on returning to the street, there, evidently waiting for me, stood my ministerial friend, who had just before given me 5 cents. All kindly expression had left his face, and he was most indignant. He called me a cheat and an impostor, declared that I ought to be punished, that he had half suspected me at the time he gave me the money. I had told him that I wanted it to buy bread with, and that he had turned and followed me with the view of watching my further proceedings. In my confusion I stammered out something about the coldness of the weather, but he was too angry and indignant to listen to any such arguments, especially such patent excuses, and I began to feel no little alarm at my situation when he announced his intention of having me arrested by the first officer who came along. I had no idea, however, of patiently waiting till an officer did come along, and I started off up Houston Street at a pace that was totally inconsistent with my apparently shattered condition. To my annoyance, on looking back, I discovered that the gentleman was following me. I hurried on all the faster, but luckily for me, he gave up the chase at the end of the first block, for when I again looked round he was retracing his steps to the Bowery. I breathed more freely, and, gradually reassuming my slow and limping gait, I emerged once more on Broadway, and crossed over to the other side. The sidewalk was thronged, and I began steadily but cautiously to ply my fraudulent vocation once more. I walked slowly up, confining my attentions principally to those ladies who were looking into shop windows. This was the most successful hour of the day. Before I reached Union Square, I had increased my stock of funds by 32 cents. Along the Broadway side of Union Square I took nothing, but from the northwest corner of the square up to 23rd Street, I again reaped a bountiful harvest, and a little more between the Hoffman House and 34th Street. From that point I struck across to 4th Avenue, but 4th Avenue is far from being a good begging district. I did not take a single cent all the way down to 10th Street. There were no loungers about. Everyone I passed seemed to be in a desperate hurry, either to get home or to reach the Harlem depot. But by this time it was 7 o'clock, and a few spits of snow were beginning to fall, so I determined to seek the lodgings of my theatrical friend. I had had, too, quite enough of amateur begging. As soon as I had a good wash, and had assumed my ordinary clothing, I lit a cigar and sat down to talk over the events of the day with my friend. He was astonished at my success, for when we came to turn out the pockets of my begging pantaloons, we found no less than $2.33 as the result of my day's labours. And to this sum must be added the 10 cents which I had expended in the Bowery Liquor Saloon for that hot whiskey punch which came so near to getting me into trouble. This was not bad business for less than 7 hours' work. Certainly the most successful begging walks, as far as my experience goes, are between Bleecker Street and 14th Streets, and 17th and 23rd Streets. In some cases a party of 3 ladies will give a trifle. The porticos of the principal hotels, too, are generally good for 5 or 10 cents. Elderly, respectable ladies, and young girls from 18 to 25 years of age seem to be more willing to give away small sums in the streets than gentlemen or fashionably dressed middle-aged ladies. I can only say that I found it so in my one solitary experience of begging. Begging in bar-rooms uptown appears to be useless. The begging fraternity have long given it up, though in the business quarters of the city it is considered to be a very profitable branch of the profession. I must confess that my personal experiences in begging have vastly increased my sympathy for beggars. The hardships of such a life must be fearful, especially in the depth of winter, and I do not hesitate to say that, though professional begging is a most unmanly, if not dishonest means of making a living, the professional beggar earns every cent he gets. It would require a large sum to tempt me again to tramp the streets as an amateur beggar.